One of the most talented juniors on the planet, also gave us some of the most exciting chess on the board this week. Of course, I'm talking about the second youngest Grandmaster in the history of our game, the young Dommaraju Gukesh of India, or better known as just Gukesh, and will likely mostly just be known by his chess as he continues to improve and impress us throughout his career. He won in round 9 at the Cannes Open 2020 over Harutian Barseghyan, the Frenchman, and in this critical position, Black played the move knight to e3, a super aggressive move, a move that actually opens up the queen and bishop to work together on the light square diagonal. Of course, the knight is also attacking the rook and putting pressure on the square g4. Looks extremely dangerous in a position where Black is already up 2 pawns and may normally be enough to beat most of his opponents, but Gukesh plays a calm and perfectly brilliant move here to ultimately take this game. I'm going to leave you with the teaser. Maybe you can start thinking about what that best move is in your head before we get back to it. And until then, let's review the entire thing from start to finish. So as we dive in, Gukesh plays in English, and we get a pretty standard move order approach, at least until this moment here, where instead of the most popular move, bishop to g2, or others that are also popular, things like e3, Gukesh plays the move e4, goes immediately for the Botvinnik English structure. Now, in a perfect world, let's say Black does something random. Often White will try to get a structure like this, with the pawns perfectly balanced in the center. A very, very solid position allows for play on both sides of the board to advance the f-pawn at some point, and in some cases we advance on the queen side. This is exactly what White wants to do, and if you let the knight come to e2, where it protects c3 and will ultimately capture back with a pony, you won't even get to double White's pawns and stop them from that type of plan. That's exactly why Black takes on c3 in a lot of these games. But note after b takes c3, Black does not often take yet again. They play d6. Part of the reason for that is that knight takes e4 can be met by queen to d5, a double attack, or after a few of the obvious exchanges, we're in an endgame where White has the bishop pair, Black has lost the right to castle, and it's not worth grabbing that e-pawn at all. I should note that on move 4, a move before, instead of taking c3, you can of course also play the move castles. This move is actually played by Fabiano Caruana as Black versus Magnus Carlsen in one of their World Chess Championship tiebreak games back in London 2018. You can look up that game or check out my blog at Chess.com if you want to be refreshed at what that was. But rather than going in 4 castles and allowing knight g to e2, as I said, we protect the knight with the other knight and ultimately try to get that solid Botvinnik structure. That's what Caruana allowed versus Magnus Carlsen. Here, Barseghyan captures on c3 instead of castles, and we get the position right here after d6. f3 is played here pretty commonly, and the reason is that maintaining flexibility in our development plan is one of the key goals for White. Of course, you could protect the e4 pawn with a move like bishop g2, but in a lot of these lines, you actually prefer the bishop coming to one of these squares, believe it or not, and protecting the c4 pawn can also be important. By playing the move f3, yes, you take away the natural square for the knight, but you also open up a potentially new square for that knight to find as a home. After the move a5, knight h3 is indeed played. The knight ultimately comes to f2. And after the move knight to c5, we get Gukesh playing the first official novelty in the game. It's not necessarily a move that I'm applauding as much better than the move tried previously. Here Gukesh plays the move bishop e3, but as my blog shows, and just to give you some more context and knowledge about this position, one of the things Gukesh had in mind, as we're going to see, is he actually liked the bishop on e3 as a solid way to grab the dark squares. It also obviously protects the knight here, and his main goal for this knight is actually to stay behind the pawns here on the king side. Gukesh, as we're going to see, has pretty aggressive and ambitious goals for these pawns to eventually start expanding and maybe create a king side attack. For those reasons, keeping the knight on f2 was one of his key ideas. But as the many-time Russian champion Peter Svidler showed, the other approach here is to play bishop e2 and actually leave that e3 square open, because eventually you want to bring the knight there where it can head into these d5 and f5 squares. I spent some time looking at this opening after what Gukesh did and also diving a little bit into how Peter Svidler played the game previously. Personally, I actually think that this variation and remaneuvering of the knight by Svidler might actually be the most sound approach for White. But as we said, Gukesh is young, he's aggressive, he has an attitude of no risk it, no biscuit in this game, and that's exactly how he plays. Bishop e3, bishop e6, and now the queen comes to c2 to guard e4. Overprotecting it is going to allow us, after a4, to immediately start the aggressive plan of f4, which is what he does. The queen and knight were needed together to defend the e4 pawn, and thus allow white this aggressive expansion with f4, and hopefully going for more. Hey, that rhymed. So, as I said, it's not necessarily that this plan is better, I don't think, than what Peter Svidler did. It's just a different, maybe more aggressive way for Gukesh, for white to play the position, and that's what Gukesh did. After f4, we get b6 to overprotect the knight. It makes sense, especially when d takes e5 would be a problem, one that would actually lose the knight if you let white take on e5. So b6 makes a lot of sense. But it also has another purpose in addition to overprotecting the knight to stop taking. It actually opens up this diagonal, which we're going to see is a pretty good plan used by Barseghyan, not just for the queen, but maybe ultimately something this bishop might have to use if white indeed eventually expands with f5. Well, guess what Gukesh does next move? f5. Here comes the bishop retreating to this new diagonal. The bishop comes to g2, and after queen to c8, we get castles. Now, the position is one that looks like some versions of different Sicilians, where if black wants, you can consider moves like h5 to stop the expansion of g4, or at least try to slow it down. But the other thing that black can do here is say, well, you've committed a lot of pieces to this side of the board when you already had some positional weaknesses over here on the queen side. So I can also just play some principled chess, bring my queen to a6, and start attacking c4. It's what Barseghyan did. After the move rook e1, we get a creative way to defend the c4 pawn. Nothing like protecting a pawn with the idea of trapping a queen, right? So if you ever can, don't defend a pawn with just a simple defensive move, kids. Prepare to trap a queen. All right, queen a6, bishop c6 is played. Here comes bishop to g5, threatening to take f6. Pretty much forces the knight to retreat. You don't want to allow those double pawns. And after the move queen to e2, it still wasn't totally necessary to guard the c4 pawn in this way, but as we're going to see, the queen has other reasons for being on e2. Black plays the move b5. Now, on the one hand, you look at this move and it's trading off white's weakness. The b5 pawn is certainly a healthier pawn objectively than the doubled c4 pawn. But the main thing here is that black's bishop on c6 doesn't have a bright future without some sort of reopening of the space. So b5 is creating and trying to open up variations for activity in exchange for the weakness. Of course, whenever we get the b file, there's also the potential of targeting the b2 pawn here. Makes sense. c4 played by Gukesh is a no-brainer. You have to keep the queens on the board when you have the ambitious goals that the youngster does. After queen to b7, we're getting closer to our critical moment. Rook a to b1 played to overprotect the pawn, especially when you may have to retreat this bishop. You don't want to undefend b2 for a moment when that bishop has to use d2 as sort of a rerouting post. Rook to b8. Here comes the bishop back to d2, which makes sense positionally and strategically. You're trying to open up the pawn storm without a minor piece getting in the way of the pawns. Queen a6, and the move g4 is played. So a lot of what I've gone over so far was hopefully just setting the tone, describing a little bit of the storyline of the position. We saw Gukesh play this aggressive line with bishop e3 and keep that knight on f2 with the specific purpose of getting the kind of position you see here. A knight behind the center, supporting a pawn storm, and he has big hopes here. I'm going to try to go checkmate black when he inevitably castles to this side of the board, as he clearly can't castle to the queen side anymore. But this has come with some risk, and I don't think we should ever look at great games telling ourselves a biased storyline that means that it was a perfect game throughout. I actually think there's a lot of risk to white's position here. The e4 pawn is potentially a very, very weak pawn. It does block white's light square bishop as well. c4 is also a target that has been made weaker by this development of the bishop. And black has actually created enough counterplay here to at least have some objective pressure. The biggest issue in black's position is exactly the one we highlighted. Our fearless leader on e8 doesn't really have a home here, and it's not exactly clear whether we'd ever want to give it a home that may be about to be lit on fire here in just a few moments. So because of that, I think Barseghyan actually gets a lot of credit for his patient, flexible way he approaches the next few moves. He starts with h6 just to slow down the attack and says you don't really want to do it if you're just going to open the h-file and split your pawns, right? So spend another move preparing it. Gukesh agrees. Now I'm going to play the move rook to b6 because this rook on b6 is now no longer going to be blocked if and when I can get my queen to b7. I've suddenly created a double battery. I've got a b file to continue to put pressure on, and I've got this diagonal here, which, as I already highlighted, is hitting maybe arguably the biggest positional weakness on the board, right? The e4 pawn is a target that white has to worry about. So I actually really think Barseghyan deserves some applauding here for how he maneuvers. Rook to b6, the bishop comes to f3. We see the plan of queen to b7 employed. Now the pawn is actually under fire, so white plays bishop a5 to gain a tempo, before then coming back to c3. Also a nice maneuver there from Gukesh, rather than just putting it on c3 to start, because there's no way this rook is going to stay on a6. g6 is now played to kind of slow down some of the attack that's coming. It makes sense, mainly because by putting pressure on the f5 pawn, you make it so that g5 is hard to get. If g5 is ever played now, for example, I'll just show it, regardless of the fact that taking might open the h-file, black can just take the pawn, and e4 is simply a lost pawn because it's pinned to the bishop on f3. So g6 as an aggressive kind of pawn move is actually slowing down white's attack. It's a nice move. The move queen to e3 is played. As I said, the rook's going to come back to b6, not going to stay on a6. And here Gukesh plays the move king h2, kind of a patient way to sit on the space advantage. All of these moves over the last few moments have actually been pretty high level by a couple of young players. White has this space advantage, the potential of an attack, but some weaknesses, namely on e4, c4, and b2 to come with it. But now I think that Barseghyan actually plays the best move in the game to this point. He plays the move king to d8, exclam. As I said, there was no way the king could ever safely put itself on the king side, especially not after the last couple of moves of h6 and g6. Pretty much would be suicide. And the move king to d8 says, you know what, even if I have to get there the old-fashioned way with a manual stick shift, I'm still going to get there. Slowly but surely, my king will not be in the line of fire. And probably this was a little bit frustrating for Gukesh. Again, we're going to get to some really exciting moments, and I've certainly already foreshadowed, because I know you watched the beginning of the video, that in the critical moment, Gukesh comes through in the clutch. That's the storyline of the game. But I actually think there's a little bit of experience highlighted here for the young 12-year-old Grandmaster from India. Maybe he's 13 now. I don't even know these kids these days. The point is that when your opponent puts a hard stop, gives you a hard no on your plan, how you adjust and are able to remember the big picture of any chess game is to win the game, not how you win it, right? And sometimes we can get married to our plans and really just get a laser-focused tunnel vision, if you will, on one side of the board because we wanted the attack. Perhaps instead of recognizing that there was no reason why white needed to force and continue to try to play on that side of the board. Being patient here, just sitting tight, was probably fine for white. The move knight to d3, as I analyzed at the blog, inviting the trade, even if it does come with knight c5, is actually totally fine for white, because that trade of knights removes some protection of the dark squares and maybe opens up other ways long term. The position is roughly equal and would have a lot of play. But Gukesh really wants to make the kingside pawn storm work. So he plays the move knight h1. This move itself was not punished duly by Barseghyan, but this was the start of a plan that shows a little bit of impatience by Gukesh and as I said, some inexperience. If black had actually found the move h5, this move is perfectly timed to punish the fact that the knight retreated. Now, remember, you can't play g5 or really even g takes h5 without running into the idea I already said. Black can take on f5, and we have a pin on the f3 bishop. This is key, because if we can't deal with the h-pawn advance by either taking or advancing, well, the next move is going to be a captures on g4, and Bob's your uncle over here on the h-file. Maybe not quite, but maybe Robert's your uncle, right? Or, you know, I don't know, another name for Bob, right? William, I don't know. The point is, be careful, right? So this is going to be a problem on the h-file. Again, this wouldn't have been an issue if the knight is on f2 guarding e4 and g4 with further protection. So after the move knight h1, fortunately for Gukesh, Barseghyan doesn't see this move h5. He actually plays the move queen a6 to go back for this pawn. But after the move knight g3, he's reminded, hey, I actually am not threatening to take this pawn. I'll show a fun line just to show you exactly why you're not threatening to take this pawn. Even with a second win of a pawn on a2, white actually has a very, very nice maneuver to trap the queen. If you want to pause your video, I'll give you about 2 seconds because I'm going to keep talking. It goes rook a1, queen b3, rook a3, queen c2, and then rook c1. An idea I found in analyzing this game pretty deeply with the engine. So that maneuver, though, is actually very key. Remember it. It's not just for kicks and giggles I'm showing you. It works because the pieces here are coordinated and defending each other, which means that taking c4 can always be met by bishop e2, and queen takes a2 is always met by rook a1. That's a key point, as we're going to see in the game. Because in this position, after knight g3, queen a6, the move king c8, rook f1 is played. We still haven't blown it yet. Black still can't take the pawn. But after the move rook h7, an awkward, rather mysterious rook move by black, Gukesh actually returns the favor by playing an awkward, rather mysterious rook move for white, a move that should have lost the game for Gukesh. Queen takes c4 is now played, and the main point, the twist ending, bishop e2 doesn't work anymore. Queen takes a2, hits the rook with tempo, and there's no rook a1. Without rook a1, you can go a number of places. Rook f to f1 protects the rook to try to renew this threat, but there's a number of things and different moves on the queen side black can already play. Things like a3. Actually, things like a3 don't quite work because we can still play this idea, but there is one really interesting line where black can take f5 and play rook g7, and one fun idea is that in these variations, when you try to trap the queen, black has rook takes g3, and ultimately heading into an endgame where he has 3 full pawns plus complete dominance over the queenside bind for the exchange. You can check these variations with the engine. You'll see that they are clean and accurate for black. And this is one of the key reasons why Gukesh's move rook f2 was actually a pretty big blunder. Undefending, uncoordinating the rooks allow black to take c4. Now, you could spin this as Gukesh ultimately finds a way to open the queen side, and from a practical perspective, it is risky. I'm not going to underestimate that for black to take this pawn, right? The king is here sitting. Anytime you open up variations, or let's say open lines, open highways on the side of the board where your king is, that comes with risk. But I think that, again, that would not be doing justice to the full drama of this game. The truth is this was just good for black, and black at Barseghyan gets a lot of credit for the moves I said earlier, the rook b6 maneuver, the queen battery with the rook to keep all these options open, right? The king d8 slide, because when he put Gukesh in that impatient position and he started making these mistakes of retreating the knight and playing rook f2, this position, by taking c4, is just good for black, not just because of a2, but actually e4 is still the biggest weakness on the board, the biggest permanent weakness. So the impatience that can happen when we're trying to force one line of play can allow our opponent's counterplay to blossom, something that the most experienced grandmasters are very good at, just allowing different ways to win, not getting married to one idea of attacking, especially when all these pawns, as sexy as they kind of might have been if the king had castled short, are now maybe just overextended and potentially making white's king weaker than anything that black will experience on c8. So good lessons, I think, and again, we're highlighting the real truth of these games, which is not to believe that just because white won this game, that there really weren't a lot of mistakes and things to learn as far as what happened. After rook to d1, the a2 pawn is possible to take, but black plays the move knight to f6. Bishop to e2 is played, and black misses the move that really would have put the game in a knockout. He succumbs to the fact that e4 has been so weak, and that was the last, I guess, major purpose of putting his knight on f6, right? He's got all these pieces kind of poking at e4, and he ends up taking e4 with the knight. However, in this position, if black had found and realized the key point, which is that bishop e2 is not only now not trapping the queen takes a2 was possible, but there's actually even something better. The bishop isn't even threatening to take the queen. The best move is g5 here for black, an exclamation point move, sinking and fixing the g4 pawn forever, with the main point being that bishop takes c4 just loses to knight takes g4, black wins the queen and returns the favor and wins a whole bunch of pawns with it. If bishop takes c4 is impossible, what's it all about, Alfie, right? What's the point here? e4 is falling next. If you take, you're just opening the king side. I analyzed the line with h5, but after queen takes a2 now, we've won this second pawn. e4 and g4 are still the weakest points on the board that either structure has, and let's not forget, white is already down 2 peshki. So this was really black's final moment, I think, to kind of put the game away. Instead, he settles on the move knight takes e4, still better, but already we start to see some of Gukesh's aggressiveness, the young practical kind of fervor start to pay off. He takes on g6, opening the rook on the f-file. Now he actually takes on e4. Variations at my blog show that rook takes f6 would be another example of where Gukesh maybe should have allowed the advantage to evolve and not just want to keep the rooks on the board for checkmate. The main line is just that after takes, queen takes b6, because if you take, you allow knight takes g4 again. We get this long and kind of forced endgame where white probably had good drawing chances due to the fact that the obstacle bishop nature of the endgame maybe gives white some decent holding opportunities. So he misses this, and I think, again, this is part of his wanting to keep the attack going and plays knight takes e4. But at this point, after queen takes e4, queen g3, knight d5, we're already getting closer to a much more unclear position. Bishop a5 is played, and you may remember this position as the one we had on the board to start the video. Now, this was also black's last chance. Instead of playing the move knight to e3, which we're going to find out what Gukesh's response is, if he saves the rook with the surprising move, rook takes b2, actually, allowing bishop a6 check, which is a discovered check, and hitting the rook. The point is he has bishop to b7. If you take on b7, you can take with the rook, saving the day. And if white takes here, black takes. And now with a couple pawns for the exchange, combined with this light squared bishop and the fact that it may just come right back to the ideas Barseghyan tried to go for in the game, black is probably the one in control. Combine it with the things that knight e3 and knight f6 are both coming to g4. Again, as I said, the light squares are owned by black, and white doesn't have the knockout blows that Gukesh got in the game. So the Barseghyan, I think, approach of dealing with the over-aggressiveness by Gukesh earlier worked out well, patiently, running the king over, really coordinated well. And sometimes when you get an advantage, now you feel like it's your turn to just kind of convert, right? So you start losing your objectivity and convincing yourself these variations must be winning. I've been outplaying my opponent. This guy went for a bogus kingside pawn storm. I got my king safe with this really nice run over here. And the reason I'm elaborating on these mindsets, I guess, one, I'm a teacher at heart, so forgive me. I'm doing this for those reasons and for those of you who want that kind of insight. I think that it's actually very applicable to your own games, because when you have an advantage, you start to give yourself the expectation or the sort of entitlement that you believe you're one moment away, you're one move away from delivering the knockout blow. And so you start to calculate your variations with that type of bias in your thinking. And I think that's exactly why Barseghyan plays the move knight e3 and just misses Gukesh's subtle and brilliant response. The variations here are very simple. They say, well, you can't take b6 because now I take d1 and I've not only won material back, I've removed your mating defender. What else can't you do? You can't play the move. Let's see. Sorry, I went ahead too fast. You can't move your queen, obviously, without things like taking on g4. As we said, the rook can't protect itself from the knight because h1 is threatened to be mate. It's very difficult to see a reason why I can't just continue to take on b2 in the next moves. So it's very easy to understand why knight e3 is such a powerful tempi move that opens up this battery. In addition to the fact that the knight doesn't hit just d1, it hits g4, right? Which means, are there ever going to be variations where that bishop moves and my knight on e3 isn't doing some serious damage? So all these things kind of convince you just go for this powerful move. But after the very simple move, rook e1, this is what Gukesh found. The whole evaluation switches. You can put it on the Chess.com analysis board and put it on before knight e3 and then after this and see the rook e1 and the evaluation bar slide up. Suddenly, black's position falls apart. The knight is actually pinned on the e-file to the queen due to the fact that if it ever moves, bishop a6 is check, a move that before wasn't that big of a deal. If you don't do anything, I'm also threatening to move the bishop because the knight is pinned, in addition to the fact that I'm threatening to take your rook. Running away too aggressively, you also have to keep in mind that the f-file is open for white and the counterplay that might come there toward the king. So rook e1 just puts black's pieces suddenly in a ton of awkward positions. The rook can't move anywhere without allowing the bishop to come to a6, and you can't just sit tight because I'm going to take the rook, right? So suddenly just a simple move that puts the rook on a defended square points out that not only have you stopped the obvious capture and checkmate, but you pointed out that black's move knight e3 is a very regrettable one. Move the knight anywhere, you change your mind, I don't want that knight to be pinned, you're going to lose your queen. So in this position, Barseghyan takes his time, ultimately panics, and we get to see the final thrilling climax here from Gukesh. He plays rook takes b2, but here we go. Bishop a6 check is played, and after the move king d8, we get our last chance to pause the video. Make sure you find the best move. Hopefully you've done it. Note that rook takes e3 still doesn't work because of queen h1 mate. Queen takes e3 would allow the move queen takes e3 because yet again, if you take, I can take f2 with check, and then black is actually up the exchange. But the simple move is just rook takes b2 now. You allow knight takes g4 and hide the king to h3, and suddenly you do the math and you go, how did white just win a rook? A few moves ago, white was down 2 pawns for very little compensation with accurate play. But suddenly this move allows the brilliant sort of counterpunch. We win the rook on b2, and after knight takes g4, king h3, you can see that black is quickly running out of firepower. He plays the move queen d5 because the first lady is under attack, and here comes Gukesh. Rook to b8 check, followed by the very sweet and sassy bishop takes c7. Nothing like grabbing a pawn when your king's on h3 and you're still worried about the light squares. This move also opens up the 8th rank and things like bishop d8 for threats. Bishop d7 allows, indeed, that move, bishop d8. King f7 allows rook to b7, pinning the bishop. No good discoveries from the knight, especially when your bishop is hanging. So the king goes to e8. And now after bishop to b6, a very nice move that not only opens up the 8th rank for business, but actually guards some of the critical squares on this diagonal. For example, you can play a move like rook b8 first, and I think it's actually probably still winning, but after some checks, just to show you might retreat for the draw or allow queen d4 check. The position is actually still a little precarious. So white makes the very nice and accurate decision to play bishop b6. Good, accurate move order. It is the best. After rook to f7, he finds rook to b8 check, king to e7, and then delivers the final blow with bishop d8 check and bishop to f6, a discovery along the 8th rank where the move bishop to e8 would just lose the knight for free. So indeed, Barseghyan resigned. Funny to note, I did analyze that rook f7 was kind of the final losing move for black, where Barseghyan had really let this one slip. It took away the f7 square, which is what makes rook b8 and bishop d8 kind of happen. A funny idea is that if black actually just plays this move h5, and I analyzed this over at my blog, even when you're up a rook, the king is stuck on a potential discovery here. Now after h5, the knight's protected, and there is no rook takes d7, just eliminating the defender and sort of simplifying our advantage. White would have had to find, under time pressure, some pretty accurate moves here to convert the game, believe it or not. There are still all kinds of discoveries. It's not simple. You can make a lot of wrong moves here. If you move the bishop, you lose the rook. Any other wrong squares of pieces could allow devastating discoveries. But the most accurate play is to put the rook on b8, not for the check, because king f7 is now safe, right? Remember the move I said Barseghyan played rook f7 was the last bad move. But you put the rook there for safety. You actually remove the queen's gaze of the rook so you can play bishop e2 and threaten to start making trades. This would have been the most accurate and kind of needed variation for Gukesh to find. Funnily, queen takes a2 still prevents bishop takes g4, because bishop takes g4 and takes would actually be mate or win of a queen. But finally, after queen takes a2, white can play queen f3 check, because moves like knight f6 are met by moving the king, and I'm either going to play rook f1 or things like rook f8 and sacrifice so I can break into f6, and white should go on to win the game. So even with h5, Gukesh was ultimately winning, and my computer is ultimately giving me dings. I guess I forgot to turn off my Chess.com alerts. Someone wants to partner me at Bughouse. Isn't that a fun thing? And now I'm getting spammed by Bughouse requests. LOL. Thank you for checking out this video. Click on one of these other 2 videos to keep watching videos within the Chess.com library here on YouTube. Appreciate it. Hope you're enjoying these Game of the Day analyses by the different authors we have on the YouTube Chess channel. And I will see you around on Chess.com.